The door. I've never been one for spontaneous getaways, but after months of nonstop work, I decided I needed to break a weekend away somewhere quiet, remote, and far from the city. An Airbnb listing caught my eye, a small house nestled in the woods, isolated but cozy, with no nearby neighbors. Perfect. The pictures showed a warm, inviting interior, all polished wood and soft lighting. It seemed like the perfect place to unplug and unwind. When I arrived, though, the house didn't look anything like the photos, at least not from the outside. The paint was peeling, the windows were clouded with dirt, and the front steps creaked ominously under my weight. There was a heavy air of neglect, as if the house hadn't seen life in years. But I figured I'd been too quick to judge. Maybe it just looked worse than it was. After all, the reviews were glowing. The front door stuck a bit before it swung open, revealing the cozy, well-maintained interior that had been promised. The contrast was almost jarring. Inside, the house felt alive. Warm light poured from old-fashioned lamps. The furniture was clean, and the wooden floors gleamed under the soft glow. A faint smell of pine and lavender lingered in the air. It was charming, almost too charming, given the state of the exterior. But I pushed the thought aside, telling myself I'd gotten a good deal. I spent the first evening settling in, reading by the fireplace, and cooking a simple meal. By the time I was ready for bed, I had almost forgotten the unsettling appearance of the house from the outside. Almost. It wasn't until I was getting ready to sleep that I noticed it. A small door, tucked into the far corner of the living room wall, barely 3 feet tall. At first I thought it was a crawl space, or maybe a storage compartment. But something about it didn't sit right with me. The door was old, much older than the rest of the house. The wood was dark and warped, and the paint had chipped away long ago, revealing splintered edges. There was no handle, just a keyhole. I tried to open it, of course. Curiosity got the better of me, but the door wouldn't budge, not even a millimeter. I examined the keyhole, thinking maybe there was a key hidden somewhere in the house, but I found nothing. That's when the unease started creeping in. There was something about that door that felt wrong, like it didn't belong there, or like it was hiding something. I brushed off the feeling, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The house was old, it probably had weird quirks. Every old house does. That night, I fell asleep quickly, the warmth of the fire still lingering in the room. I must have been asleep for a couple of hours when I heard it, a soft, steady knock. At first I thought I was dreaming. But the knocking continued, slow and deliberate. I opened my eyes, blinking in the darkness. The room was silent, except for the faint rustling of the trees outside. And then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the living room. I sat up in bed, my heart starting to race. For a moment I stayed frozen, straining my ears, hoping it was just some kind of weird settling noise or maybe a branch tapping against the window. But the knocking was too rhythmic, too precise. I swung my legs out of bed, my feet hitting the cold floor. As I moved toward the living room, the knocking stopped. The house was dead silent now, the kind of quiet that presses down on you, thick and suffocating. I stood there in the middle of the room, staring at the small door. It seemed almost expectant, like it knew I was there. I waited, listening, but there was nothing. No more knocking, just silence. I forced myself to walk back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept circling back to the door, to the eerie knocking. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But the unease was still there, lingering at the edge of my thoughts. The next day passed uneventfully. I spent the morning hiking through the nearby woods, trying to shake off the strange feeling from the night before. By the time I returned to the house, I felt calmer, more rational. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the living room floor. I couldn't help but glance at the door again, half expecting something to be different. But it was just as I'd left it closed, unmoving. That night, the knocking started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was unmistakable, coming from the small door. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just some quirk of the old house. But as the knocking continued, the unease in my stomach grew, twisting into something sharper, something closer to fear. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way back into the living room, the beam of light trembling slightly in my hand. The knocking stopped as soon as I entered the room. I stood there, staring at the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Something was behind that door. I didn't know how I knew, but I did, and whatever it was, it wanted out. I felt a surge of panic, the kind that made my hands shake and my throat tighten. I couldn't stay here, not another night. I had to leave. I rushed back to the bedroom, hastily throwing my things into my bag. As I zipped it up, I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was louder now, more frantic. I nearly dropped my bag as I bolted for the door. My heart was in my throat, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get out. I fumbled with the front door lock, my hands shaking, my mind racing. As soon as I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me and I slammed the door behind me. The knocking stopped. The house stood there, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from the house. Even then, the tension didn't leave me. My heart was still racing, my mind replaying the sound of that knocking over and over again. I don't know what was behind that door, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'm never going back. Something in that house wasn't right, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what it was. I left a review on the Airbnb listing. I didn't mention the knocking or the door. I just said the house didn't feel like the pictures, that it wasn't what I expected. I've checked since then, out of morbid curiosity. The listing is gone. A shadow in the silence. It all started with a cough. Nothing serious, just a dry, annoying tickle in my throat. Mom insisted I stay home, even though I felt mostly fine, but she's always been the overprotective type. So while my family went about their usual routine work, school, errands, I found myself alone in the house. For the first time in a long while, I had the entire place to myself. It was peaceful at first, quiet, but it wouldn't stay that way. The house I grew up in is one of those older suburban homes, the kind that creaks and groans as it settles, with hallways that feel a little too long at night and rooms that never seem fully lit, no matter how many lamps you turn on. But it was home. It was safe. Or at least I thought it was. It was early afternoon when I started noticing the feeling of being watched. At first I chalked it up to my imagination, a side effect of boredom and being stuck in bed all day. I mean, who hasn't felt that eerie sensation when they're alone in a big, empty house? I tried to distract myself with TV, but every now and then I'd glance at the hallway leading to the kitchen and swear I saw something, a shadow, maybe. It was subtle, just a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. Then it happened again. This time, when I turned my head, the shadow didn't vanish. It shifted. I froze. My heartbeat drummed in my ears, and for a second I convinced myself I had imagined it. But I knew what I saw. It wasn't a trick of the light. Someone was there, standing just out of sight, barely visible from the edge of the hallway. My chest tightened with fear. I told myself it had to be a mistake. My brain was playing tricks on me, too many horror movies maybe. But then the sound came. A faint shuffling, like the scuff of a foot against the floorboards. Slow, deliberate. I wanted to call out, ask who it was, but my throat had closed up. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even move. Instead, I strained my ears, hoping for any other sound that might confirm I was being paranoid. But the house was silent, save for my own shallow breathing and the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to get up. My legs were shaking as I moved, but I had to check. I couldn't just sit there waiting. I stepped cautiously into the hallway, my socks muffling my footsteps. The air was colder here, and the shadows seemed to cling to the walls. I hesitated, peeking around the corner where I thought I'd seen the figure. But nothing. The hallway was empty. The kitchen was empty. For a moment I laughed nervously at myself. Of course there was no one there. What was I thinking? Still, I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at my gut. As I turned to head back to the living room, something caught my attention: a door. The door to the small, unused guest room at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar. That was odd. I was sure it had been closed earlier. I walked over, my hand reaching for the doorknob, but before I could open it, I heard something movement. Not loud, but distinct. The sound of breathing. Slow, steady, controlled. My heart leaped into my throat, and I took a step back. There was someone behind that door. I stumbled away, my mind racing. My phone was in the living room. I needed to call someone. Anyone. I dashed down the hall, my feet barely touching the floor, grabbed my phone from the coffee table, and dialed my mom's number. It rang once, twice, and then went to voicemail. Of course, they were probably still at work or out running errands. I was alone. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to leave the house, to run out the front door and not look back. But something kept me there, a mixture of disbelief and dread. This was my house, my safe place. How could there be someone here, someone living just beyond the walls without any of us knowing? I checked the locks on the doors, pacing through each room like a paranoid maniac. Everything was locked, bolted, and secure. No signs of forced entry. Nothing. But the feeling, the gut-wrenching certainty that I wasn't alone, wouldn't leave me. And then something clicked in my mind. The attic. We never used it. In fact, I couldn't remember the last time anyone had been up there. But it made sense, didn't it? If someone was living in the house hiding, they would need somewhere out of sight. Somewhere none of us ever went. I grabbed the stepladder from the closet and dragged it to the hallway. My hands trembled as I unfolded it beneath the attic hatch. The pull cord hung from the ceiling like a noose, swaying gently as I stared up at it. Every fiber of my being told me not to open it, but I had to know. I pulled the cord, and the hatch creaked open, revealing a dark, gaping hole above me. The musty smell of dust and insulation wafted down. I hesitated, my fingers gripping the ladder. Slowly, I climbed up, sticking my head through the opening. At first, I saw nothing but the usual clutter: old boxes, holiday decorations, and forgotten junk we'd accumulated over the years. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small mattress, dirty and worn, tucked into the far corner of the attic. Beside it, there were empty food wrappers, water bottles, and clothes. Some of them looked like they belonged to me, others to my family. But it wasn't just the objects that terrified me. It was the fact that the mattress looked recently used. I backed down the ladder as quickly as I could, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, and I nearly tripped over my own feet as I stumbled away from the attic. Someone had been living in our house. Someone had been watching us, listening. All this time, while we went about our lives, completely unaware, they had been right above us. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body was frozen in place. And that's when I heard it again, the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps. But this time they were coming from behind me. I turned slowly, dread coiling in my stomach. Standing at the end of the hallway, half hidden in the shadows, was a man. His clothes were dirty, his hair wild and matted, but his eyes were sharp, alert, and focused directly on me. He didn't say anything. He just stood there staring. For a moment, neither of us moved. I couldn't. The air between us was thick with tension, and the only sound was the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then, without warning, he took a step forward. That was enough to break the paralysis gripping my body. I turned and bolted for the front door, fumbling with the lock as panic surged through me. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely turn the key, but eventually the door swung open, and I threw myself outside, slamming it shut behind me. I ran. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street, panting and gasping for breath. I called the police, my voice barely more than a whisper, as I tried to explain what had happened. When they arrived, they searched the house from top to bottom, but they didn't find him. The attic was empty, the mattress gone. Whoever he was, he had vanished without a trace. But I know what I saw, and I know, somewhere, he's still out there. I'll never forget the first time I found the photo under my door. It was a crisp autumn morning in 2015, and I was in my usual rush to get to work. I remember hearing the soft scrape as I opened the door, and there it was, a single photograph lying face down on my welcome mat. I picked it up, barely glancing at it, assuming it was a misdelivered piece of junk mail. But as I turned it over, my stomach sank. The photo was of my house. Not just any house, but my house, my exact apartment building in Chicago. And it was taken from a strange angle, like from the bushes just across the street. I stood there for a moment, my brain struggling to connect the dots. Why would someone take a picture of my home? Maybe it was an accident. Maybe some real estate company was collecting images for listings. I convinced myself it was nothing and slipped the photo into my jacket pocket, hurrying off to catch the train. For a few days, I didn't think much of it. Life has a way of making you forget things that don't seem to matter. But then 3 days later, I found another photo. This one was worse. It was of my living room, taken from outside the window. It showed the exact spot where I sit on the couch every evening, directly facing the television. I could see my coffee table, A book one had been reading, a half-empty glass of water. My blood ran cold. This was no accident. Someone had been outside my window, someone had been watching me, and I had no idea. I felt a wave of paranoia wash over me, but I told myself that maybe it was still just a prank. People do weird things for attention, don't they? I lived in a quiet neighborhood, full of old brick apartment buildings and tree-lined streets. I hadn't had any issues before, no break-ins, no threats, nothing. I convinced myself again that it was just some stupid joke. I shouldn't have ignored it. The photos kept coming, once or twice a week, always in the morning, always slipped under my door while I was still sleeping. Each time the angle got a little more intrusive. First, the living room from different windows, then the kitchen, then my bedroom. I hadn't even realized how easy it was to see inside my apartment at night, how careless I'd been about closing the blinds. There was one that showed me sleeping, curled up under my blankets, unaware of the camera that had been trained on me from the darkness outside. I was terrified. It didn't feel like a joke anymore. It felt sinister. But what was I supposed to do? Go to the police? What would I tell them? That someone was leaving creepy photos under my door. I didn't even have any evidence of a crime. Just fear. I bought thicker curtains. I started locking all the windows every night, even the ones that barely opened. I installed a few extra locks on my door and checked them obsessively. Still, the photos came. Each time, my hands shook as I unfolded them. They were always simple, printed on cheap glossy paper. But the content, God, it made my skin crawl. The final straw came one night when I was woken up by a noise outside my bedroom window. It was a faint scraping, like something hard against the glass. I didn't move at first, frozen in bed, heart pounding in my ears. My first thought was that it was just a tree branch, or maybe an animal. But then I heard the sound again, long, deliberate. Someone was trying to open my window. I shot out of bed and ran to the window, pulling the curtains aside. My breath caught in my throat as I saw the silhouette of a man standing just outside, his face obscured in the darkness. He didn't flinch when I opened the curtains. He just stood there, staring at me through the glass, his hands still on the window frame. I screamed and ran to the door, fumbling for my phone. By the time I got the courage to look back, he was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. My brain was on fire, replaying the image of that figure over and over again, wondering who he was and why he was doing this to me. The next morning, there was another photo. This one was different. It wasn't just of my apartment or the view through my windows. It was of me standing in front of my bedroom window, staring out in terror. The timestamp on the bottom corner was from the night before. I went to the police that day. They didn't seem particularly alarmed. The officer at the desk took my statement with a bored expression, asking me routine questions about whether I'd had any disputes with neighbors or if I had any known enemies. I didn't, of course. They promised they'd look into it, but I could tell from the way they spoke that they thought I was just another paranoid city dweller. They suggested I install security cameras and get in touch if the situation escalated. It had already escalated, but I took their advice anyway. I bought a set of cameras the very next day. Small, discreet ones that I mounted on my windows and front door. I felt a strange sense of relief after they were installed, like I finally had control over the situation. Whoever was stalking me wouldn't be able to sneak up anymore. I'd see them coming. A week passed, and for the first time in months there were no photos. I started to relax, thinking maybe the cameras had scared them off. Maybe it really was just a sick prank and they'd finally lost interest. But then the footage came. I had set the cameras to record any motion at night. One morning, as I was reviewing the footage from the previous evening, I froze. There he was, the same figure, standing just outside my bedroom window again. He didn't try to open it this time. He just stood there, motionless, watching. Then, slowly, he raised a camera to his face and took a picture. After a few minutes, he left. I felt sick to my stomach. The police had done nothing, and now I had visual evidence of someone stalking me. I immediately called them again, and this time they sent someone out to review the footage. The officer who came to my apartment seemed more concerned, but he still didn't seem to grasp the gravity of the situation. They asked if I could recognize the man, but the camera angle wasn't clear enough. His face was hidden in shadow. That's when I started digging into my own past, trying to figure out who might want to do this to me. I couldn't think of anyone at first. I had no enemies, no one I'd crossed or upset. But the more I thought about it, the more one name kept coming back to me: Paul. Paul had been a colleague of mine at my previous job, back when I worked in an insurance firm. We hadn't been close, but we'd worked together for years. Paul had always been quiet, a little strange but harmless. Or so I'd thought. Things had gotten tense when I'd been promoted over him, and soon after he quit. I hadn't heard from him since. I did some research online, finding out that Paul had moved back to Chicago around the same time the photos started. That was enough for me. I gave the police his name, told them about our history. They finally took me seriously and brought him in for questioning. Turns out Paul had been obsessed with me for years. He'd followed me when I left the insurance firm, kept tabs on where I lived, and started taking the photos as a way to feel connected. He admitted to everything, from the photos to trying to break into my apartment that night. He said he didn't mean any harm, he just wanted to be close. He was arrested, but even after all this time, I still feel like I'm being watched. The photos stopped, but the fear didn't. Even with Paul locked away, there's always a part of me that wonders if he's really gone or if there's someone else out there, camera in hand, waiting for the right moment.